Nothing gets me madder. I was ready to do something stupid. My blood was boiling. The over 55 community I live in has a fancy recreation center. I've been swimming there all summer, but just last week I wandered into the weight room where the treadmills are and stuff like that. Usually the first couple of times I went in the afternoon when there was practically nobody there. But this time I went in the morning and it was much more crowded. And I'd gone back into the back room to do some leg lifts when I noticed it. Talking, loud talking in the weight room. And it didn't stop. And there were lots of people talking. Now, I've been in a fair number of fitness centers over the years, and the noise you normally hear is a combination of this sort of grunting noise, like, and these sounds of weights clanging against each other. Even the TV has little FM transmitters so that everybody can put earphones on and do their treadmill stuff in silence. Why were these folks talking? Don't they know the rules? Now, to tell you the truth, I hadn't seen a sign that said silence is golden or anything like that. Instead, most of the crowd was fine with it. And they were the ones talking. But it violated something inside of me, my inner rule of health clubs, or something like that. Now, out on the bocce court, everyone was silent. Conversation was subdued when it did happen. I think the guys who run it kind of instill that in everybody. If you talk too much, maybe you don't get invited to play. Anyway, this particular morning I was trying to think through today's sermon, which is about different understandings of moral behavior and how Unitarian Universalists have a particular set of morals that we follow, or rather, several sets. And then it struck me. The women in the next room had a different understanding of moral behavior in the weight room than I did. They were operating in a different moral system. So I'd been reading about a system developed by Lawrence Kohlberg called the Stages of Moral Development. It's a model shows how people decide if a behavior, doing a particular thing is good or bad, moral or immoral. And Kohlberg used this wonderful but somewhat complex example to explain how moral reasoning changed at different stages and things like that. So I want to be simpler this morning, so I'm going to give you different arguments that people might use as to whether they should go to the dentist or not. Okay. Anyway, sorry, Beth. Beth and I were talking about going to the dentist this morning, so but I can't change my examples right now. Anyway, the reasoning is different depending on, like, for example, what you'd say to a 3-year-old is different from what you'd say to a 13-year-old, which is what you'd say to a 33-year-old, or what you'd say to a 70-year-old or 90-year-old. In the early stages of moral development, decisions tend to be self-centered. Like there's what's called the obedience stage, which is, if I don't go to the dentist, my dad is going to hit me. Okay. There's a slightly more advanced exchange stage where somebody says, if I go to the dentist, my dad is going to take me for ice cream. This isn't the most enlightened dad in the world, but anyway, these early stages are really simple. They deal with individual reward and punishment, okay? Got those basic ideas down? Then the middle or conventional stages, the decision maker takes other people into account rather than just themselves. There's something called the conformity stage, which says, everyone else has good teeth, so I'm gonna go to the dentist and be like them. Still higher up is the social order maintaining stage. Good teeth make America strong. In other words, my moral action of getting my teeth cleaned makes the social order function. It's a bit far-fetched, but stay with me for a moment here. Because then Kohlberg talks about the post-conventional stages of moral reasoning, where others no longer matter directly, but principles and rules matter. Someone at the social contract stage might explain things that a system where dental health is available requires that each of us patronize dentists, thus keeping them in business. It's sort of like why people buy from community farms or local fish shops. They think a society where there are CSAs and where there are fish stores is a good society, so they're going to do something to maintain that social contract. And the highest level of Kohlberg's work is the universal ethical principles stage. I can't think of a universal ethical principle of dentistry. Kohlberg used the example of Gandhi's commitment to satyagraha, nonviolent resistance, as an example of principled moral behavior and how this affected every stage of his life. We might see a few of these different stages in the health club regime. For example, if somebody came over and glared at you if you were talking and sort of looked like they were threatening to hit you, you would say, this is the obedience stage, right? It was avoidance of pain is what you're doing. That's why you're keeping quiet. Or someone might come over quietly and say, at this country club, we don't talk like this. That would be the conformity stage. Or maybe if the exercise is yoga or Tai Chi or something that seems like a sacred ritual, silence would be enforced through this universal ethical principle of respect for religious observances. So everybody, as they got close, they'd suddenly start to whisper. They'd just be quiet while they walked past. And you could think about Unitarian Universalism with respect to these stages too. The obedience stage is pretty simple. You'll go to hell if you don't come to church. Hell's a pretty good motivator. But beyond the obedience stage, there's the exchange phase, a stage, which is come to church and you'll go to heaven. Again, that's not a really big UU angle. As we get up to the conventional stages, you start to see the parallels. All the cool kids are in the UU youth group, so I'm going to join it. That would be said by a boy who was in the conformity stage of moral development. And then there's being part of a church home brings peace of mind to my parents, which might be a social order maintaining stage statement of a couple that attends the UU. This is especially true in the South, where when people talk about their weekends, it always includes going to church on Sunday morning. And so Unitarian Universalist churches represent a church you can go to. The order is everyone goes to church. You just get the choice of which one you go to. And then as we go in the higher levels of Kohlberg's thinking, we leave the opinions of others behind and start to do things of our own volition. Our congregation is a beacon of hope in this community for those who need us. That's a sort of a social contract with the world. Keeping the congregation strong is a noble moral calling. And then we have the 7 principles of the Unitarian Universalist Association, which are sort of like universal ethical principles by which all people can live. And so maybe that's where we are. They're at the highest moral stage, better than everyone else because we have principles. Now you know that I'm going to go a different direction with this. I am. But first, let's talk about a different religion. Let's talk about Judaism. No, I was never Jewish. I'm not Jewish. I'm not an academic expert in Judaism. But this is my understanding, and that is that Orthodox Judaism requires that Jews obey the many mitzvot that came from Moses or came from God directly. These include the 10 Commandments and about 600 other commandments. During Yom Kippur, which was yesterday and the previous evening, Jews recite a special litany as a group called the Chet. The litany refers directly or indirectly to all of the mitzvot. The litany asks God for forgiveness for violating each of the commandments in several variations. Scoffing, evil talk about another person, shady business dealings, desecrating the divine name, lewdness, and crimes that require you to be stoned to death or killed in different ways, whipping, crimes that require you to be whipped 40 times, and lots of less severe punishments. They're all listed. They're all said by the entire congregation. All these and many more are confessed to. For having evil talk about another person, we ask God's forgiveness. God's pardon, God's atonement. And in a way, if one or two members of the congregation actually had done one of these sins, they have a chance to confess it out loud as part of this litany. They are able to ask God for forgiveness, for pardon, for atonement. And it seems that if you didn't commit one of those sins, if you didn't kill anybody in the previous year, it's okay. You can still ask God for forgiveness on it, and it actually reminds you that for the year ahead, that's one of the rules. The other thing is that having everybody say things is a sort of a form of solidarity, where one person who's feeling that they are an awful person because they did something wrong they're now part of a group that's jointly repeating these things, and so they aren't alone, they aren't disconnected. I think it's kind of a pretty wonderful thing. And so it seems did the Reverend Robert Eller Isaacs, who had a bit more experience with Judaism than I have. So the litany that we just did, "We begin again in love," was his Unitarian Universalist version of a litany. You know, taken together, all of the mitzvot form a sort of a universal ethical principle. And one can live by all of them together because the precise meaning of each mitzvah is fairly well explained in the many volumes of the Talmud. Our 7 principles, they're not so well explained, which is why, while thou shalt not do such and such is a pretty firm way of saying something, but covenant to affirm and promote is pretty fuzzy comparatively. I think our Unitarian Universalist principles may actually end up being too fuzzy for a set of universal ethical laws by which we should live. Now there's another possibility, maybe this whole thing is a false scale. Maybe having universal ethical principles doesn't make people more moral. It's a known fact that Gandhi, even while he was preaching satyagraha, nonviolence, was abusive to his wife. Maybe there's something missing. Maybe the real world doesn't work this way. Maybe the model's wrong. One of Kohlberg's students, psychologist Carol Gilligan, tried to apply this scale to the decision-making processes of women who were thinking about having an abortion. Now, Kohlberg had developed his scale by asking hypothetical questions to, it turns out, white male subjects. Gilligan was talking to women of various different social classes, different races, about a very real situation. Do they have an abortion or do they continue the pregnancy? As Gilligan wrote, when a woman considers whether to continue or terminate a pregnancy, she contemplates a decision that affects both self and others, and engages the critical moral issue of hurting. In the transcripts of the many interviews, she found women saying things like, "What I wanted to do is to have the baby. What I feel I should do is have an abortion right now, because sometimes what you want isn't right. Sometimes what is necessary comes before what you want." She found that care for self and others was part of the decision-making process, often more important than absolute rules, religious dictates, or any of the things that might be written on the side of a wall or on a tablet in front of the city hall. So Gilligan came up with 3 different stages of maturity. Her pre-conventional stage is all about individual survival. Decisions are based on want or self-interest. And that's fairly similar to Kohlberg's. Conventional is all about self-sacrifice, where women especially find solutions where no one else is hurt, or if there has to be a victim external to themselves, that victim is chosen very carefully. And then the post-conventional, they take responsibility for their decisions and the consequences and the care for themselves and for others. Gilligan says, the moral imperative that emerges repeatedly in the interviews with women is an injunction to care. A responsibility to discern and alleviate the real and recognizable trouble of this world. She contrasts this to Kohlberg's upper levels, which are all about justice, rights, and principles, and not people. I'll repeat Gilligan's line. A responsibility to discern and alleviate the real and recognizable trouble of this world. I kind of like that. Moral behavior is about relationships and not hurting. So these folks who were talking in the weight room, they weren't hurting me. They were not so loud that I might suddenly drop a barbell on my toe, and I don't even lift barbells, so that wasn't really a worry there. But what they were doing, they seemed to be feeding their social network, trading information, trading care. Who was sick? Whose husband, whose children, who didn't show up at bridge last week? My rule-based mind took offense at this community building talk. But obeying my rules usually results in a fitness center full of people who barely know each other, who isolate each from each with headphones and tend to stare straight ahead when they're doing their exercises. Their social network feeds each of them and makes community. Now, coming back to Reverend Eller Isaac's litany, we begin again in love. What are the offenses or sins or trespasses that he enumerates? Remaining silent while we could have made a difference, being rigid and inaccessible because of our fears, striking out in anger, being blind to the needs of others, isolating because we are selfish, losing sight of our unity, and the mysterious admonitions of the Spirit, which I think might refer to a failure to follow our moral feelings. I might have thought that the litany should have paraphrased each of our 7 principles. For failing to use the democratic process within our congregation and within society at large, we forgive ourselves and each other and begin again in love. That's something like that. But it wasn't. He chose to name forms of disconnection, ways the social fabric is torn or worn or severed. He chose to speak in a moral language more like psychologist Carol Gilligan. Remember what she wrote? A responsibility to discern and alleviate the real and recognizable trouble of this world. It begins with a relationship. The home, the family, the neighborhood, the community. Take responsibility for your decisions. Live in covenant. Care for yourself. Don't think of this as a place like a convent or an abbey where you can leave yourself behind and go hide. Care for others. Work towards a planet transformed by our care. Work towards beloved community. Work towards right relation among us all. We all need somebody to lean on. We forgive ourselves and each other and begin again in love. We don't begin again in the old way that fueled the illusion of separateness. We begin again in love. Do you see it? Kohlberg's ladder of moral thinking from individual to social to universal may simply not be true. Universal gives us the commandment in 1 Timothy that says that wives should obey their husbands even when their husbands abuse them. Universal gives us a reading of the Bible that justifies slavery. Universal gives reasons for genocide, castration, torture, holy war. Robert Eller Isaacs sees our faith as being about relationship. And it's about creating community, beloved community beyond oppression, beyond our divisions. Perhaps the question of this world is not, what do you believe? But rather, who do you love? Or who do you forgive? Amen.